So we're going to get this thing started. Welcome everyone to our EV Charging 101 webinar. And today's topic is selecting the right charging strategy for your fleet. This is a topic that we've gotten a ton of questions about so far. And so we wanted to bring this webinar to you today to be able to answer a lot of those questions. So my name is Amanda Rogers. I'll be moderating this discussion today, and I serve as the Vice President of Marketing and Innovation here at Merchants. I'll be introducing the discussion and also our guests, our panelists that will be speaking to charging strategy and electric vehicles and fleets overall, and how that impacts operations. So logistically, throughout the discussion today, if you think of questions, please feel free to send them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. And like I said, this is a very compelling topic right now, so I'm gonna keep us rolling so that we can get to all of our content. All right, so first I'd like to introduce Hari Nayar, our Director of Electrification and Sustainability. Hey Hari, how are you?
Hello, Amanda. Good afternoon, folks. Good to be here.
Great. So Hari, would you mind giving us a little bit of your background? We'd love to hear a little bit more.
Sure thing. So I'm Hari Nayar, Director of Electric Vehicles, Electrification and Sustainability at Merchants. My mandate really is to do whatever is required in very simple terms to help our clients adopt EVs when the time is right for them, and to enable the products and services that will enable and accelerate those adoption. My background is in actually product development across multiple industries, starting with aerospace and defense, going through medical, renewables, and automotive. I don't consider myself as the fleet quintessential person. I'm more of the engineering, product development, hardware, software guy. In my life, I've been fortunate to have worked in so many different industries, and culminating in automotive, where I was responsible for actual development of kits that go into conversion systems for hybrid electric and plug-in vehicles. So very excited to be here, looking to have an engaging discussion with all of you.
Thanks, Hari. And I know for myself, I've learned so much from you over the last several months, and I'm sure so many of our listeners will learn as well today. Next to Hari, we have Scott Miller, who's the Vice President of North American Fleet Sales. We're so happy to have you here, Scott.
Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here, and thank you for hosting this session. I think there's a lot, as you said, there's a lot of questions out there as to how we do this. A lot of people have already said they're going to be converting their fleets, but the big question is how. So I run fleet sales for ChargePoint. Today is actually my 11th anniversary at the company. I started in 2010 on April 1st, and honestly, it's been quite a ride for us in those 11 years. When I started, there were no electric cars out there, no Volts, no Leafs, no nothing. Yet ChargePoint had 400 charging stations out there in the public that were running at level 1, which means it took 16 hours to charge the car. Fast forward to now, ChargePoint's a public company right now, which is really exciting for all of us who have been as long as we have here. We have over 135,000 charging stations out there, and we have a large number of fleet customers that are using our stations either for their light duty vehicles, medium duty vehicles, and heavy duty vehicles. It's a really exciting time to be in this industry. When I started, we got funding from the Obama administration to give away 5,000 charging stations. That was my first job. I thought it was the best job in the world. Now we bookend it with Biden's announcements yesterday about infrastructure and fleet and all that. So, it's going to keep going. It's exciting.
Scott, like I mentioned before, from a lot of our fleet clients, after we discuss with them their EV adoption plan, the next question is always, okay, what about charging? What about infrastructure? And I think it's really compelling for people to hear that there are so many out there already, and it's only accelerating now, and that this part of adoption is trending right up there with the production of vehicles. And that's really important. So appreciate that perspective.
And it's everything from light duty vehicles to medium to if people can see my video, to the garbage truck behind me, to streets. There's a lot of different types of vehicles being electrified today.
Absolutely. So I'll give a little background on Merchants Fleet for those of you who aren't familiar with us. And then I'm going to turn it over to Hari. So Merchants, our vision is to enable the movement of people, goods, and services freely. And so we work with any company that leverages vehicles to run their operations. And a big part of that is understanding how EVs, electric vehicles, become a smart vehicle choice for their fleets in the best way that will help them to achieve their objectives. So we offer a full spectrum of flexible and innovative fleet management services, which span from leasing and funding through fleet services like fuel, maintenance, telematics, and then our full suite of EV and energy services. And so we work in 20 diverse industries and have quite a few, we have a lot of different clients that are going to need different types of EVs. And so we are here to partner with our clients to support them in that adoption, as well as everything that has to do with technology and the consulting that they need in order to adopt these EVs. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to you, Hari, and I think it's really important for our audience and our clients and our partners to understand and really level set on what's going on in the EV landscape today and why EVs are becoming more interesting and more attractive for companies today. So do you want to take a stab at that for me?
Sure. It's a very interesting way to get into this topic here, Amanda. I mean, EVs, there's not one day that goes by right now where there is not a news about EV or charging infrastructure, right? It's ubiquitous. It is all around us. There are a couple of forces that I think are leading to that type of a prevalence of EV nomenclature and colloquial language. OEMs are releasing very capable, in many cases, very cost-effective vehicles that can do, similar types of performances to conventional internal combustion engine vehicle. So availability and diversity of EV models is continuously improving. Scott kind of touched upon this, right? We're not looking at only the small consumer vehicle or the very high-end luxury vehicle that comes at a very cost premium. Everything from garbage trucks to street sweepers to even backhoes are being electrified. So the availability of models is no longer going to be a limiting factor. Cost of ownership, it's very clear right now that it's no longer a trend. It's actually a fact. Cost of ownership of EVs is far, far, far less than a comparable internal combustion engine vehicles. Far less number of moving parts, far less maintenance sensitive parts, downtime, which people usually don't factor in as part of the cost of ownership. But if you're a business relying on your vehicle to deliver goods and services, downtime actually costs you. Those type of problems are no longer at the forefront of EV. Quality has gone up, maturity of technology has gone up. Scott touched upon, Obama administration giving away chargers to Biden administration, converting the entire fleet owned by the US government to electric, more infrastructure incentives coming through. Overlaying on top of that is the mindset that corporations have adopted where we want to be sustainable. End users are demanding that services they get go through a sustainable pathway across the entire value chain. So you add that on top of it. And then, if you look at this from a global perspective, right? There are cities, jurisdictions, entire townships where there are restrictions coming into place where you cannot bring a certain type of vehicle to this jurisdiction at all. So that type of corporate policy, not so prevalent in the United States yet, but it's just a matter of time before forward-thinking communities will adopt something like that. You mix all of this together. The solution set is actually an electric vehicle, right, of all different shapes and size. That's the only thing that can address all of these three different verticals that we have on the slide here. So it's truly exciting, to see how this whole technology is going to be transformative to transportation industry as a whole.
I just want to mention one thing is that it's not just the federal government that is establishing incentives for this. If you look around the country, there are utilities all over the country that have incredibly attractive programs. My own state of Massachusetts, the two major utilities will basically pay for all the cost of the infrastructure of the make ready of the infrastructure for certain situations. There's things going on in California and Michigan and other states, and more coming. So as people look at this, the time is kind of now to start doing this because of all these incentives that are in place right now.
Yeah, and I think, as we get further into our discussion, it will be really interesting for folks to see the timeline here, that the time is really now in terms of adoption. Hari, just to hit on something you just said, which is the cost of ownership, I think that is something very notable for our clients right now, because that's probably the biggest question we get is around that cost of ownership. But just like you said, what we're seeing is that they are becoming much more economically realistic for companies now. So looking forward to hearing more about that. In terms of the charging landscape now, Scott, what can you tell us about where things are at and the adoption of charging just nationally?
Yeah, so there's been explosion in terms of the stations that are out there available for public charging, and not just the AC stations, but DC stations and organizations like Electrify America and others that are putting stations all over the place so that people can use them. But as you think about stations for fleet, really the bulk of what you're going to be doing is going to be in your depot or at people's homes. That's where they need to park the vehicles overnight. And that's where we're seeing major investments being made across the country as people start to adapt to that.
Yeah, we can move on to the next slide, Amanda, and continue on.
Yes, thank you. I was on mute for a second. You couldn't hear me. Yeah, so, Hari, you mentioned the availability of models, and I think that was something that we got a lot of questions about early on, and it's become more and more clear what is going to be available and when. Right. So can you give us a little perspective on that?
Sure. I mean, if you take a look at this slide here, right, there's some very nice, pretty pictures of all different types of vehicles coming out. But the real takeaway message is that EVs that looking right now to the forward is not just this. If you go backwards in time, let's say 5 years, 6 years, a good chunk of this slide would have been empty practically, right? So from 5 years ago to now, just look at the different types of vehicles that are coming out. I mean, GM's spun off an entire new division called BrightDrop, and they're building a purpose-built vehicle around their Ultium battery architecture. Ford's coming out with the E-Transit. I mean, these types of vehicles are extremely capable. We're not force-fitting a technology into a solution here. These are purpose-built vehicles that can actually compete in terms of performance with an equivalent internal engine counterpart. On the far end of the spectrum, right, Rivian's coming out with vehicles that can do, adventure type sporty applications, still a little bit on the cost premium side. But as time goes by, the reality here is that availability of different shapes, sizes, different functions, vehicles that are going to be usable in multiple different applications will continue to increase. And with that increase, there naturally has to be an expansion of charging capability. But with that increase will also come an overall normalization or harmonization of cost, and cost will start to come down, right? So again, as I said previously, what used to be headwinds for the electrification has now completely turned around, and we're having strong tailwinds. This motion is supposed to accelerate over time, right? And that's actually great news, because there is, if you go over to the next slide, Amanda, there is all kinds of different terminologies that need to be understood and adopted by the market. Whereas we're used to be talking about miles per gallon, now becomes watt hours per mile. Gas stations become charging stations. Braking is no longer friction braking, it becomes regenerative braking. So the industry as a whole is going to be educated and have to become educated to be able to really understand what EVs are. But the beauty of where the technology is today, and the real beauty is that if you're driving an internal combustion engine Ford Transit today, you park it and you hop into an all-electric Ford Transit, you can start driving that thing in less than a second. There is no special training needed. This is not like trying to get certified to fly a F-25 versus when you're flying, a Boeing 737. You're not having to go through that kind of technological leaps, which makes it very, very, very attractive for fleets, operating hundreds of vehicles where driver training, driver comfort, driver safety is a huge factor, right, in continuation of business for them. And quite honestly, if you're behind the wheels on an EV, you will love the experience so much that you're unlikely to ever want to go back. So I foresee a time frame where, one of the problems in fleet industry is how do I retain my drivers and keep them happy and productive, right? Once you start driving some of these electric vehicles, the sheer acceleration, the smoothness, the quietness, it's not shaking, it's not belching diesel fumes all over the place, right? You're going to fall in love with these vehicles. That's a fact. It's not something that we can aspire for. Those things are happening right now. So
Yeah, you mentioned the kind of the pollution side of things, and I think that that's after you move beyond vehicle availability and the models that are coming out, it's a very frequent question we receive, which is, are electric vehicles really sustainable? And I think we are seeing that they are. But Hari, can you go into?
there is, and this slide actually kind of gives you a little bit of an overview, right? It is there is no point of debating the fact that internal combustion vehicles, whether it is gas or diesel, contribute a significant portion to emissions. The tailpipe emissions, and OEMs have done a remarkable job of squeezing out efficiency from the internal combustion engine. We're up against the boundaries of physics in some cases to squeeze out more efficiency from these engines. However, in aggregate, even with that levels of high efficiency, you're still contributing a huge amount to pollution. Now, let's go back roughly a year, when COVID was ravaging all around us, the height of the pandemic. There were so many news reports. The only few positive things that you could see in news at that point in time was cities like Beijing, cities like New Delhi, Los Angeles were reporting clear blue skies. This has been something that people who live in those parts of the world have been craving for a long time. The singular reason for that is less number of vehicles on the road, because people are either working or people cannot go anywhere because of lockdown mandates. So the cause-effect relationship between tailpipe emissions contributing to unhealthy air quality, more NOx emissions all around us, particulates in the air, the cause-effect relationship is extremely well understood. If you now look at the EV spectrum, the little yellow banner on the bottom, right? One could always argue that, are we actually moving emissions from the tailpipe to the smokestack? It's a very valid argument. But when you look at, Amanda, if you flip to the next slide, I think I touch upon this here, is, when we look at how much, I thought, all right, let's stay here for now, because I thought we had the energy slide coming up next, but that's fine. But if you look at, the amount of emissions from the tailpipe and compare that to the amount of emissions that come from the smokestack of a conventional, energy generation station, electricity station, we have approached a point in humanity's evolution where 20 to 30% of overall electricity is being generated from renewable sources. In 2020, the United States itself developed close to 19.8 to about 20% of electricity generation came from renewable sources that did not result in smokestack. Now, overlay that with states like New York, Massachusetts, where there is a dominance of renewable energy. And if you're operating an EV there, it's pretty clear that you're not shifting emissions from tailpipe to smokestack. There is a clear sustainability pathway here. And this is, again, something that we can have, fleet adopt today. And they will be able to realize this, because when their clients ask for sustainable practices, the number one finger pointing will be to the fleets. Your fleets, if they're not sustainable, there's no way that your service can be sustainable, right? So even a tiny migration, a small percentage shift into EVs is going to adopt that sustainability mindset quite significant.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we're seeing too, as companies across the board are looking for ways to make their companies more sustainable. It is one of the first places to look is the fleet. How many vehicles do you have, and if you can convert them over time, what that does for your sustainability goals. Great point, Hari. So in terms of inventory, do you want to speak to the demand and how things are
Yeah,
shifting
so-
over the next 5 years and what we're seeing?
Right. So this is another very interesting topic, and we get asked this question every single day. Like, okay, I want to commit to EVs. I have all the approvals from my board, all the way from my C-suite. I've got the money, I've got the will. When can I get vehicles? Right. The short and sweet answer is, in some cases you may have to wait. In some other cases, there will be vehicles that are available today. It becomes a case by case decision. But with our connections with the OEMs and looking at this demand for what EVs are projected to build and the production capacities, we foresee a time frame where there is going to be a shortfall. There is clearly going to be a shortfall because it takes time for OEMs to actually spin up their new factories, get these new designs through regulatory certs, make it to a point where the quality and the repeatability in production for these vehicles are on par with internal combustion engine vehicles. The last thing that any OEM wants is to put out a half-baked product out there, right? Because that is going to just turn the tide on EVs the other way around. So you overlay all of those factors, this kind of chart that we have pulled with OEM discussions clearly shows that there is a supply demand shortfall. The demand is high. We see this demand coming from all different industry sectors, all different fleet sizes. Now, if somebody's driving in a Ford F-150 today and he or she needs an identical F-150 size vehicle that can do the same amount of things that the F-150 can, there is not one that exists today as an all-electric vehicle. So that supply demand shortfall is expected to continue for some period of time, but we also know that OEMs are hard at work to ramp up their supply chains and go into production. So it's going to be a very, very interesting sequence of events in the next 5 years to 10-year period of time in the landscape of vehicle availability.
Yeah, Hari, I think that brings us to a really important next step, which is timing. So planning, looking at what the real timeline here is. And, Scott, I think this is a good time for you to jump in and talk about, when it comes to a vehicle availability, how should fleets be planning when it comes to their charging? So as they know vehicles are becoming available and then kind of backing into that timeline.
Yeah, so the biggest lesson learned we have from our customers that they tell us is that we had to think of the charging much earlier than we thought. So a lot of people say, oh, there's the great vehicles, let's order them, let's get them in. And they think about the charging only when they find out the vehicle is going to be there in 2 weeks. And it really depends on the vehicle and the infrastructure, but even the smallest scale infrastructure you would have, you can take between 1 and 6 months to get it in. For a home, if you're putting a charging station in someone's home, that can go quite quickly because they have control over everything. Typically, they'll have enough power in the house. But if you start talking about a small depot, they have to prepare and they have to work with their local utility company to make it work. As you get bigger and bigger scale and bigger size vehicles or more number of vehicles, that time actually spreads out. We encourage you to get in touch with the utility company very early along to understand what it's going to take so you don't get yourself in a situation where the vehicle shows up and you don't have any charging capability, because that doesn't help very much. So again, it depends on the situation. We work with a lot of customers early on to kind of analyze the situation, understand what vehicles they have, what the daily routes are, how long they're going to stay at the depot, to better understand the type of infrastructure they're going to need. Once you get that done, then you can decide, do I need to engage the utility or not? Who do I need to engage to make sure that I have it all fitting in? So let's go to the next slide.
Yeah. Scott, I think that really important points. And as these fleets are adopting EVs, what do you think they need to be planning for specifically from a charging standpoint tangentially?
Yeah, so we have a series of questions we go through with every potential customer talking about what they're trying to do. It starts with, what are the routes your vehicles are going? One of the great things about fleets is that the routes are pretty predictable, and they typically will have a lot of information about those routes, how far they go, what time they leave in the morning, what time they come back in the afternoon. And we also talk about the type of vehicles they need to get, because are they available now? Are they not available now? And based on all that information, we can put together a preliminary charging plan for exactly the type of charging you'll need. Do you need fast chargers? Or can you get away with slower chargers, which are a lot less expensive and a lot less expensive to install? So in all that, we put that plan together. And once we have that plan together, then we can say, okay, now, when are you going to get the vehicles? When do you think they'll arrive? So that we can start engaging and try and figure out how you're actually going to get this all installed. And remember, it's not just installing stations. There's energy management to think about, because you can literally charge a bunch of vehicles at the same time and go over where you're going to start hitting demand charges. So the stations are quite intelligent now, and you can actually manage the power so that you're not going over your demand charges. I have 2 case studies at the end. I'll talk about that in a couple cases, and so people can understand what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
If I talk about the places that people charge, so there's 2 primary places a fleet will want to charge. One is at a depot, and that's where most people think it is. Okay, I'm going to put them at a depot. But surprisingly today, a lot of people have fleets where the vehicles are being taken to people's homes. An example of that would be a sales force that has vehicles that the company is thinking about moving from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles. I can tell you right now, there's a trend primarily in pharmaceutical companies where they're starting to announce equipping their sales force with green vehicles, electric vehicles. And as part of that program, they're going to be equipping people with charging stations at home. They're going to think about being able to get them reimbursed for home energy. And they're also going to think about when that vehicle goes out into the wild, how do I get charging en route as well? We're working with merchants on several cases where that's a case. And the other one is in the depot, same thing. You'll do 90% of your charging in the depot when vehicles come back. But there's always going to be that case out there where there's somebody out in the wild that needs to get a quick charge so that they can get back to the depot. So you want to make sure you have accommodation for that as well. If I talk about the depot itself, though, you're thinking not only about the stations, you're thinking about the energy management software. You're thinking about how do you manage that energy so you don't go over your demand charges. But you're also thinking of things like your integrations with some of the other systems that you're currently using to manage your fleet. Whether you use telematics today on your vehicles, does the charging infrastructure integrate with the telematics so you can know, what's happening from that standpoint? Do you use fuel cards? And can the charging infrastructure integrate with your fuel card system? And finally, many people have, whether it's fleet management software, asset management software, you want to make sure that that charging infrastructure gets fully integrated into that, because then you'll have the smoothest transition from non-electric to electric. No one's going to go overnight and change everything. So there's going to be a mixed mode for some period of time. And so as you're looking at that, you want to think about that. I've got 2 case studies I want to talk about because these are often more interesting for people as they look at what other people are doing out there. So my first case study is a retailer. So this retailer, when they hit into COVID, they had 2 issues. One was they had a bunch of their employees that they wanted to convert over to electric vehicle. These were salespeople, people going and visiting with customers. And so they needed an approach to be able to handle these at-home stations charging. They wanted to make sure that people could get reimbursed for the home charging. They wanted to make sure that we had a system together where they could actually get their installations taken care of in a very effective and efficient manner. They also wanted to be able to integrate with their fleet cards so that when these vehicles went outside and wanted to charge, whether it was at workplace or whether it was at other places, that we would be able to accommodate that. And so that's one of the parts of it. But the second part, which in my mind is really more interesting, is that they decided in terms of COVID that less people were coming to their stores, and they wanted to be able to deliver what they offered to the people through some type of a branded solution. So they actually bought a number of Chevy Volts, parked them in front of their retail outlets. And this is not a huge big box retailer. This is a smaller type retailer, but with stores all over the country and many, many stores all over the country. And the idea that they're piloting now is the customer orders their products remotely, and that they actually have this vehicle that's branded come out and deliver it. It's an electric vehicle. They put charging stations in front of the pilot locations. They started with 10, and they're moving now onto over 100 locations because it's been so successful. This was something that solved their problem. We worked in partnership with them and their fleet management company to actually make this happen. The second case study I want to talk about a little bit is another one, which is a bigger, heavier duty solution. This is a company that has box trucks that deliver their products last mile on a daily basis. The box trucks come into the depot at about 4 or 5 o'clock every night, and they go out the next morning or 8 or 9. There's many of time to charge up these vehicles. But they also have yard tractors at the same place that are, going around dropping product off to different vehicles, whether it's, it's electric vehicles or ICE vehicles, but these are electric yard tractors. And the challenge with the yard tractor is they need to be running as many of the 24 hours a day as possible. So when they go into charge, they need to be able to charge, very quickly, almost to the expense of the other vehicles. But what this particular organization has done is they've got a system where they can actually manage when they know that yard tractor is charging, and they can pull much of the power away from the other vehicles at that time. You can't really do that in a gas environment. They also have another limitation. They wanted to keep the power that was supplying all these charging stations below 180 kilowatts. And the reason they wanted to do that was that at 180, they were going to start incurring demand charges. So they wanted to do that. So if you think about it, they set up a charging infrastructure that would allow them to pump 125 kilowatts when needed to the yard tractors and allow them to charge in under an hour a piece. And they would actually pull the power away from the box trucks. But they also had it calculated that they knew exactly how long the box trucks would need to charge so that they had 100% charge by the end of the evening. And because the box trucks were there for so long, this was something that worked out very effectively. Very much needed to make sure there was a software available to manage that power between the yard tractors and the box trucks so everybody would be happy at the end of the day. And so this is a pilot again, doing it. I think they have 12 of our CPE 250 charging stations, and they're powering basically, I think it's 8 box trucks and the possibility of 2 yard tractors to do this. So far, so good with the results. And so you can see the variations in terms of the applications from the first company that's actually managing home charging and making sure that people can get reimbursed for that, all the way up to somebody wanting to be able to manage a slightly complex situation. And by the way, one thing they keep telling us on all sides is for the fleet operator, for the driver, it's got to be as easy as possible. The driver doesn't want to figure out what to do. They want to get back, they want to plug in, they want to leave. The depot operator, same thing. They don't want to figure out anything. They want it all programmed in advance. So all they know is, are the vehicles plugged in, to make sure that somebody didn't forget to plug in, because that would be a problem. And is the system operating the way it should? And that's kind of what all this software does to bring it all together. It makes it quite easy and simple to do that.
So Scott, I think that's really news and or good news for folks that you're talking about charging in an hour. And that, I think, is another question we get a lot, is how am I going to have this vehicle on a charge for half a day? And that's something that I think the industry has worked really, really hard at making sure that fleets are going to be able to accept the adoption and charge in their time.
So the industry, including us, have charging solutions that will go from, you can charge as low as 2 kilowatts or kilowatts all the way up to 350 to 500 kilowatts. So there's a lot of choice there. The bigger ones are much, much more expensive, not only to buy, but also to install. And of course, you're using a whole lot more energy. So there's a real balancing act. And that's where we're discussing with people way up front. what are the vehicles, what are the routes, so we can recommend the best solution for them. Because you may think, oh, I need a bunch of fast chargers, and then you look at the price tag and you say, oh, I can't afford that. But you may not need it. So we would work with you to figure that out. And another point there, the DC fast chargers, you may think they're the right solution because you're looking for flexibility, but you may not need it. So.
Well, along those lines, oh, go ahead, Hari.
If I may,
Yeah.
when you look at the conundrum of charging on the vehicle side, right? There's already a prevailing trend in the OEM space to go from what was previously like a 600 volt powertrain architecture to an 800 volt powertrain architecture. The fact that we want to be able to charge faster and faster and faster is a well understood requirement across the industry. So I think, entities like ChargePoint and Scott, as they pointed out, they are continuously upping the power handling capability of the charger itself. And the OEMs are also trying to stay in sync by increasing the voltage handling capabilities of the powertrain voltage on the vehicle side. So we're at the cusp of another leap forward step here, where the overall time duration to charge and to get a meaningful amount of charge, go from 0% state of charge to 80% state of charge in a matter of 10 minutes, kind of that type of capability across wide swath of vehicles, right? That leap forward in technology is like well within reach.
Yeah, people have the mentality, it's like a gas car. I should go fill it up, it'll be done in 10 minutes. And, the way you actually do it may not require that. So you have to really look at that. The other thing I wanted to mention, which is really interesting about fleets, and I think you're going to see a lot of evolving business models. People are going to say, well, how do I afford all this charging infrastructure and all this? How do I do that? And because a fleet is very predictable, we know how many vehicles, how far, where they're going to be, that there's a lot of people out there today that will actually fund these. So you don't have to necessarily pick the cost up at the very beginning. You can pick it up over time. So as you're making money with the lower cost of the vehicles, you could be paying off the charging infrastructure, or even some people are suggesting that they operate them for you, and that you end up paying on a per kilowatt or a per mile or something like that, which mitigates the risk a little bit. And the reason this is more possible now is because the predictability of a fleet versus a public infrastructure where you don't know if people are going to come or not.
Great information from both you, Scott and Hari. So we have about 5 minutes left, and we do have a bunch of questions. So I'd like to at least start a few, and then we will reach out and answer your questions directly, especially for those of you that have asked some very pointed questions about your specific fleets. But let me start with one that I think will be applicable for a broad audience. Is if it's a charging question, and if you leave a laptop or cell phone charging overnight, it eventually hurts the battery. Is the same thing true with vehicle charging? If it takes hours to charge a vehicle, people will not stick around and watch it. If left overnight, will it ruin the battery? So Hari, do you want to start?
Sure. It's an interesting question. Obviously, Kirk, who asked that, has thought about and tried to correlate cell phone to the EV battery. The short answer is that leaving the vehicle battery connected to the EVSE is not going to ruin the battery at all. At where it stands, like the level 2 type of charging station that Scott talked about, which is the most prevalent at this point in time, you're going to take anywhere from 4 to 6 hours to go from 0% state of charge on the battery to 100%. But that 100% is only 100% for the user. The battery still has a reserve capacity on top of that, which is not available to the user. So from absolute terms, the battery is still not fully charged. There is still room above. And similarly, 0 is not actually 0. There is room below. So you're operating the battery within, think of it as guardrails, and there is excess capacity on either side, right? So leaving it plugged into the charger is not going to hurt. In fact, some of the OEMs do recommend leaving it plugged in because there are ancillary loads and other computational things that are happening on the vehicle that can actually use that power. So there's no known issues of leaving it connected.
I will say that we're learning a lot. So the Leaf came out in 2010, and now they've got 10, 11 years of experience with the car. And there's a big concern at the very beginning that these, the batteries, how long will they really last? I mean, they're expensive, these battery packs. And the concern was, was it going to only last 3 or 4 years? They were putting guarantees of 8 years on those vehicles. And I think they've outlasted their expectations in terms of how long the batteries indeed did last. And it's because of a combination of the charging management station, charging management capability on the vehicles themselves that will actually slow charging when it gets close to a full state of charge. It works the same way with DC, that they won't let you power all the way at 100%, to 100%, because that'll affect the battery. So they're managing that.
So one for you here, Scott. What is a demand charge?
So a demand charge is a charge that the utility will charge when you go over a certain amount of power brought in. So for instance, in the case that I talked about, for them, it was 180 kilowatts. So if you go 1 kilowatt over 180 kilowatts for about, I think it's 15 minutes, then you literally have to pay a much higher fee for your electricity across the board, not just for that short period of time, but across the board. And if it's 15 minutes in a given month, you would have to do that. So there's a real interest in making sure you manage how much power is coming into your facility so you don't have to pay that fee. And it's great because the smart charging stations, some of them at least, have that capability to be able to limit that so you don't go over the fee.
Great.
Yeah, there's an interesting way to look at the demand charge too, right? The utility has no way to understand, like, at what point in time is a particular demand for electricity going to happen on the grid. So they are always on standby to watch for that demand and make available that energy. So there's a cost for that. And that's really what translates to the demand charge that people end up getting. I mean, large industrial operations are always at the mercy of this, and they hate those charges.
I saw a couple of questions on home stations, so let me quickly address those. So are there demand charges for home stations? So the answer is the home stations charge at 7 kilowatts. These DC chargers can go up to 125, 150. So you typically in a home don't get any kind of demand charge risk. The other question was, what about the liability risk at home? I'm putting a home charging station at home. What is the liability there? So first of all, a home charging station runs off the same that a dryer runs off of. So, essentially it's like running a dryer, and the charging stations from all the vendors should be UL certified, outdoor certified, so that you don't have any problems. We have literally had, we've got 35,000 home charging stations out there right now, and have really never had a problem with them because of the UL stringent requirements on making sure that they're okay. So, I wouldn't worry too much about people putting home charging stations at home, because there really doesn't seem to be an issue.
Okay, we do have quite a few more questions that will certainly guide us in our next few webinars. Why don't we wrap up with this one, which is for both of you. How does a fleet get started? Where should they begin? Hari, how would you answer that?
Planning, upfront planning, just because of the two topics we touched upon, right? There is a time function in being able to get vehicles, and there's also a time function in getting the infrastructure ready to charge these vehicles, right? In some cases, vehicles are available today and you can have small scale stations going, but if you're a real fleet that is looking at multi-geographically dispersed sites that you want to electrify, there is an upfront planning exercise that is needed, from selection of the vehicle to getting the charging stations down selected to getting boots on the ground and charging stations deployed. So first step is to plan, and then understand what type of rebates, incentives can be available, because they can be significant and that can actually offset a lot of the cost. And from there on, it's more of end user adoption. When the vehicle arrives, how does the vehicle and the charging infrastructure that is deployed fit into your day-to-day operation? I can't emphasize the need for upfront planning, though.
From my perspective, what you want to do is you want to get in touch with your fleet management company, Merchants, and you want to get in touch with somebody who knows infrastructure, ChargePoint, and we can have an introductory call with you and talk about what you're trying to do, how you're trying to do it. And I think together we can help you plot out, kind of what you might need looking forward to it. And then we engage further on that. We have a great partnership with Merchants. And, I think the fleet management company plays a very important role to help you with that. as does the charging infrastructure company.
Excellent. Well, anything else you guys would like to add before we wrap up?
No, I'm super excited at, what the whole transportation sector is going to go through over the next, 5 to 10 years. It's going to be transformational. And for me personally, it is more of a privilege to be, embedded in this, having been on the design side of things and also now on the execution side. It's just remarkable. I'm really looking to accelerate this mission and, to support all our clients in their pathway to EV adoption, really.
So for me, is a lot of people think what drives this is the environmental benefits, and clearly there are lots of environmental benefits. But if you really look hard, as Hari showed you, there are fundamental economic reasons why an electric vehicle will be less expensive for you over time. And it's, there's a lot of things that are published now. The city of New York has published a bunch on their track record over 5 years with electric and non-electric vehicles and the cost savings that they're actually seeing. So you actually can put ROIs together on this stuff, and you can justify costs of doing this. And I think we're going to see a lot of people moving faster. When the federal government, the utilities are providing all these incentives out there now, it's really a really interesting time to look at.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that I'd just like to reiterate that merchants, ChargePoint, our ecosystem of partners, we are here to support you through this transition. Our goal is to stay out in front of it for you. And that's what we do for our clients. So if you have additional questions, if you'd like to speak with one of our consultants, we're happy to do so. Please feel free to reach out. That's all for today until we get back online for our next EV webinar. Have a great day, everyone. And we'll be sending a link out as well. So if you want to share or re-listen, you're welcome to. Have a
And if
great
you
day.
want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me, Scott Miller, ChargePoint on LinkedIn. Happy to talk to anybody.
Yes. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for that.
Thanks a lot.
And Scott, Hari, thank you both. I learned a lot, and we'll see you next time.